The movie begins with a helicopter flying in the air, heading toward a cargo ship nearing the port. Accompanying them are customs officials aboard a speedboat, also heading for the ship to conduct an inspection. On board the ship is a young man named Andy who sees the approaching officials and quickly wakes up his companion. The two panic and immediately take action, leaving their cabin with a bag in hand. Andy runs outside, and before the police can catch him, he throws the bag containing illegal drugs into the sea. The scene transitions to New Orleans, where Chris is attending the wedding of his best friend, Danny. Another friend, Sebastian, approaches them, along with Chris's wife, Kate. Moments later, they speak with a man who marvels at how they managed to smuggle a luxury car. Chris explains their strategic smuggling methods, which always prove successful, earning him the title of the top smuggler in the country back in the day. While alone, Chris is approached by Jim, his former smuggling boss. Jim checks in on him and asks what he's been up to lately. Chris replies that he now runs a business installing home security alarms. Chris's father also works for Jim as a smuggler, but is caught and is now serving time in prison. Jim mentions that Chris should return to what he does best, suggesting he let him know if he ever changes his mind about getting back into smuggling. Meanwhile, Andy and his companion Walter go to a secluded spot to meet with their boss, Tim Briggs. They explain that customs officials suddenly arrive to inspect the ship, leaving Andy no choice but to throw the drugs into the sea. Upon hearing this, Tim and his men angrily ram Andy and Walter's car. Back at the wedding, Kate receives a phone call informing her about what happened to her brother Andy. The three immediately head to the hospital to check on Andy's condition. When they arrive, they learn that Walter is undergoing surgery due to severe injuries. Andy, on the other hand, has only minor injuries, and Kate questions him about what happened. Andy admits he throws Tim's drugs into the sea when customs arrive for an inspection. He apologizes to Kate, while Chris explains the situation to Sebastian and asks him to look into Tim. On the way home, Chris reassures Kate that he will take care of Andy. They return home and put their two children to bed. The next day, while installing security alarms for a client, Chris receives a call from Sebastian. Sebastian informs him that Tim was released from prison 2 months ago and is currently at an old bar. After work, Chris goes to the bar and finds Tim, who turns out to know Chris because he once worked with his brother in smuggling before he died. Because Andy is family, Chris tries to negotiate with Tim, offering to pay for half the value of the drugs. However, Tim refuses, demanding the full amount of around $1 million. Chris argues that it's impossible, pointing out that in smuggling, throwing drugs overboard is a common response when customs officials board the ship. He suggests that Tim would have done the same if he were in Andy's shoes before leaving the bar. Chris meets Sebastian, who is at a support group, and asks what they should do. Sebastian suggests their only option now is to smuggle again, promising to cover the money they'll need. Chris visits Andy, who tells him Walter passes away last night and that he plans to flee the country to hide, fearing Tim's threats. Chris tells Andy that running won't solve anything and that he'll help him for Kate's sake. Chris then goes to Tim's house to inform him that it will take a month to gather the money. However, Tim refuses to wait that long, threatening that if Andy dies, his family will inherit the debt. Chris attacks Tim and warns him not to harm his family, threatening that he won't hesitate to kill him. Following the confrontation, Chris decides to follow Sebastian's suggestion. With Andy in tow, Chris visits Kate at work to explain the situation. He tells her they have no other option and convinces her to let him take on one last illegal job on a ship. Later that day, Chris visits his father, Bud, asking for help getting on the ship he used to work on. Knowing Chris is doing this for his family, Bud agrees to help. Chris tells Sebastian their plan to go to Panama. Sebastian assumes they'll be buying drugs from their friend Ruben, but Chris clarifies that no drugs are involved. Instead, they will buy counterfeit money worth $15,000 from an acquaintance named Edwin. Sebastian will borrow money from Jim to purchase counterfeit bills. Once they hand the bills over to Jim, they will use the payment they receive to settle the debt with Tim. That evening, they assess the ship's crew to identify potential accomplices, including their friend Danny, who works on the ship. The next day, Chris calls Edwin to request counterfeit bills identical to the ones he previously purchased and also asks for a van. Later that day, Chris finalizes the preparations for their plan. He meets with Sebastian, who gives him the borrowed money in a bag. That night, Chris bids his family goodbye before heading to the dock with Andy. They manage to board the cargo ship unnoticed by Captain Camp and his crew. Once in their cabin, Chris removes the hidden cash strapped to his body and places it in a bag. They sneak out and stash the bag inside a wall compartment before being spotted by a crew member. Chris heads to the cafeteria where he meets mission accomplices Olaf, Tariq, and Danny. However, the captain notices Chris and approaches him, questioning how he got on board, knowing him as Bud's son, who was also a smuggler on his ship. With no other choice, the captain assigns Chris to clean carpets. That night, while cleaning in the control room, Chris secretly retrieves the ship's map from a cabinet. This allows him to identify potential hiding spots for the counterfeit bills, and he starts drilling a hole in the wall. The next morning, Chris gathers his team, explains the plan, and shows them the hole he drilled behind a storage area. However, the captain's crew suddenly arrives, forcing them to quickly cover the hole and leave. Back in their cabin, they discuss the plan further. Chris explains that once the ship docks in Panama, he will retrieve the money from Edwin and bring it back to the ship. Tariq points out that they don't have much time for all that, so Olaf proposes creating a diversion by cutting the ship's oil supply to slow its movement. Meanwhile, Tim keeps an eye on Chris's family. He goes to the back door, forces his way into the house, and attacks Kate. He threatens her, saying he will return next week and asks her to inform Chris. Tim and his men leave before the police arrive. Back on the ship, while secretly reducing the oil, Chris is called upstairs to answer a phone call. It's Kate, who informs him about what happened, so Chris instructs her to call Sebastian. Later that day, as the ship approaches the port, Sebastian visits Kate's house and suggests they stay at his place, to which Kate quickly agrees. The captain orders the ship to slow down, but with too much oil lost, the brakes fail. Chris sees this and angrily scolds Danny for spilling too much oil, which could lead to the ship crashing into the dock. The crew does everything they can, but the ship doesn't slow down. When the ship crashes, several containers fall overboard. Furious, the captain comes down to investigate. Olaf claims it's a propeller jam, but the captain suspects someone tampered with it. Chris retrieves the hidden bag of money, and while the captain is preoccupied with the damage, he leaves with Danny and Andy to meet Edwin. While driving, Danny apologizes for the accident, but Chris assures him it's fine since it bought them more time. Meanwhile, Sebastian takes Chris's family to his house to keep them safe. When Chris and his group arrive at Edwin's place, they inspect the counterfeit money, but Chris senses something is off. He tests the paper with iodine and discovers that it's not the high-quality counterfeit that was promised. Edwin explains this is all he has and apologizes. He reveals that the bills Chris is looking for are with a man named Gonzalo, prompting Chris to decide to go see him. Edwin apologizes again and offers them a van for free. At a football game, Sebastian, who is with Kate, receives a call from Chris regarding the situation. Sebastian suggests buying drugs from Ruben instead and using them to pay off Tim and Jim. However, Chris firmly rejects the idea, insisting he'll handle things his way. After the call, Sebastian excuses himself to leave. Chris's group now has only about half an hour before the ship departs. Sebastian goes to Tim's house to warn him not to harm Chris's family, reminding him they are his family too. It's then revealed that Sebastian and Tim know each other and are secretly working together. Sebastian tells him that if he hires a competent smuggler instead of Andy, their drugs will arrive without any issues. Tim apologizes, explaining that he gives Andy a chance only because he is Chris's brother-in-law. When Chris reaches Gonzalo's warehouse, Tim heads to the soccer field to keep an eye on Chris's family. As Chris inspects the counterfeit money, Andy receives a call from Tim, who threatens to kill his nephew if he doesn't follow orders. Tim instructs Andy to take the bag of money, go to Ruben to buy drugs, and deliver them to him. Chris and Gonzalo meet, and they already know each other. Gonzalo shows Chris around the warehouse and mentions that they plan to rob an armored truck today. When Danny returns to the van to drive it into the warehouse, he realizes that Andy and the money for the purchase are missing. Gonzalo offers to give the counterfeit money for free if Chris joins him in robbing the truck. Chris refuses, stating they have a ship to catch, but when Danny tells him about the missing money and Andy, Gonzalo becomes furious. He accuses Chris of deceiving him and threatens to kill him, but Chris asks if the offer to join the heist and receive the bills for free is still on the table. Gonzalo agrees to the idea and orders his men to take their IDs. Meanwhile, Olaf and the crew are still repairing the ship, but the captain gives them only 10 minutes to finish. Olaf calls Chris right away, telling him that time is running out, so Chris orders them to delay the ship's departure. Gonzalo instructs Chris and Danny to wait for the armored truck and block its path when it passes by. However, when they try to stop it, the truck doesn't slow down and instead rams their vehicle. The truck driver calls for backup, but Gonzalo and his men suddenly arrive and blow open the truck's rear door. While Chris and Danny struggle to get out of their van, Gonzalo and his men emerge and kill the truck driver and guards. After eliminating everyone, they retrieve a large painting from the truck. Meanwhile, Tariq secretly bribes some crew members to delay the ship's departure, giving Chris more time. Gonzalo removes the painting from its frame, but the police arrive, leading to a shootout. The SWAT team joins in, killing most of Gonzalo's men. Gonzalo manages to escape in a car, with Chris and Danny joining him, but Gonzalo is grazed by a bullet on his neck. The police try to chase them, but they get away after a bus blocks the road. Andy returns to the ship and ignores Tariq's questions about Chris's whereabouts. When the trio reaches the warehouse, Chris takes the painting from Gonzalo and places it in their van. Chris attempts to retrieve their IDs from Gonzalo's pocket, but Gonzalo suddenly wakes up, asking to be taken to the hospital. The two load Gonzalo into their van while the police surround the warehouse. They manage to escape, but Gonzalo doesn't survive, so they take their IDs from his pocket and dump his body out of the vehicle. Olaf and the crew start warming up the ship's engine to prepare for departure, while Chris and Danny are en route to the ship. Upon arriving at the dock, they present their IDs to gain entry and drive the van into a container. The container is then lifted into position. Tariq approaches them with cleaning supplies and begins helping them unload the counterfeit money to hide it elsewhere. Meanwhile, the captain receives a call from customs ordering an inspection of the lake containers. As the inspectors approach, Tariq and Danny manage to move all the counterfeit money. After cleaning the van, Chris escapes before being caught. The captain inspects the van and finds only the painting, which they assume is just a tarp, and notices that the van has been recently cleaned. When Chris returns to his cabin, he finds Andy and begins to beat him for his actions. He demands to know where the money is, and Andy admits he has to use it to buy drugs. Andy plays Tim's voicemail, where Tim threatens to kill Chris's child if Andy disobeys. Upon learning this, Chris grows furious, but apologizes to Andy. Chris calls Kate, who is at Sebastian's house, to check on them. After confirming their safety, Chris heads to the money stash and places the drugs inside. The next day, Chris calls Sebastian to inform him that Andy has brought drugs. Chris says he intends to dump the drugs into the sea, but Sebastian warns him that they would all be in trouble if he did. Jim later confronts Sebastian, threatening him if he fails to provide the money. A tearful Sebastian responds, knowing he would be in even deeper trouble if Chris dumps the drugs, as he is unaware that Chris has the counterfeit money. He believes that if Chris returns empty-handed, they can't pay their debts to Tim and Jim. That night, Sebastian goes to a bar and tells Tim to threaten Kate, warning her that Chris should not dump the drugs. Preparing for their return, Chris devises a clever plan to avoid getting caught with the money by using salt bags tied to the counterfeit bills. When the salt dissolves in water, it allows the money to float to the surface. Meanwhile, Tim attacks Kate to force her into telling Chris not to dump the drugs into the sea. When Sebastian arrives, he pretends to stop Tim from going too far with Kate. Kate and the children go to her friend Jenny's house, and she calls Chris to relay Tim's threats. Chris wonders who has told Tim about his plan to dispose of the drugs. He confronts Andy, asking if he has leaked the plan, but Andy firmly denies it. When Chris asks who he buys the drugs from, Andy says he has been instructed to buy them from Ruben. This leads Chris to realize that Sebastian has betrayed him. In the middle of the night, Kate returns to Sebastian's house to retrieve their belongings. The inebriated and drugged Sebastian approaches her, attempting to stop her. He even attempts to flirt with her, forcing Kate to fend him off and try to escape. She runs into the bathroom and locks the door, threatening to call Chris and report Sebastian. Upon hearing this, Sebastian forces the door open, accidentally pushing Kate, causing her to hit her head. Sebastian tries to wake her, but she is unresponsive. At that moment, Chris calls Sebastian and tells him he knows about the betrayal and his collaboration with Tim. Sebastian tells Chris to just hand over the drugs and avoid any trouble, but Chris refuses, saying he is coming for him. Realizing everything is spiraling out of control, Sebastian calls the captain, reporting that Chris is smuggling on his ship. Sebastian instructs the captain to confiscate the items from Chris, promising him a portion of Chris's profits in return. The captain agrees but warns that if Chris refuses, he will notify customs to conduct a search. The captain confronts Chris, demanding his hidden goods, but Chris denies any wrongdoing. Due to Chris's feigned innocence, the captain says he will call the authorities to conduct a search of the entire ship, and it's certain that Chris will end up in prison just like his father. Later that day, Chris sneaks into the captain's quarters to steal his keys. While the captain is on the phone with the authorities, reporting and requesting an inspection of the ship, Chris is busy making a copy of the keys. Meanwhile, Sebastian begins disposing of Kate's body. He wraps it in plastic along with her phone, but her fingers can be seen twitching. Upon arriving at the port, all the ship's crew are gathered in the cafeteria, and the officials start their inspection. However, they find nothing suspicious apart from a hole in the wall created by Chris. They also inspect the van Chris used, finding only a painting inside, which they initially mistake for a tarp. Noting the van's pristine condition, they become suspicious and decide to question Chris. Andy manages to disembark, but Tim and his men pursue him before he can get far. Attempting to flee, Andy is cornered by the men. Lacking evidence against Chris, the authorities eventually permit him to leave the ship. After security checks his bag, Chris encounters Tim, who has Andy with him in the car as a hostage. Tim demands his drugs, and when Chris pretends to know nothing, Tim coldly instructs him to bid Andy farewell. Chris drags Tim out of the vehicle, starts beating him up, and orders Andy to run. Tim's men approach, threatening to kill Chris, but he warns them they won't obtain the drugs if he's dead. Meanwhile, Sebastian loads Kate's body into his car and drives off to a construction site. Back to Chris, he takes Tim and his men to the captain's house, using the copied keys to get inside. Chris claims it is his friend's house and that the drugs are there. Unbeknownst to the gangsters, the door triggers a security alarm that alerts the police. They approach the captain's vehicle and retrieve the carpet cleaner that Chris used earlier on the ship. It turns out Chris hides the drugs in the cleaner to avoid detection during the inspection. Tim and his men are thrilled to find the drugs, while Chris heads to the garage and steals the captain's car to escape. The captain wakes up, finding the gangsters in his house. When the police arrive, Tim and his men panics and hurriedly tries to hide the drugs. The captain lets the police in, while Chris calls Jenny to check on his family. However, Jenny informs him that Kate has returned to Sebastian to collect her belongings. Due to the drugs found in the house, the police arrest the gangsters as well as the captain, who was only involved. Chris heads to Sebastian's house but finds no one there. Sebastian, now at the construction site, disposes of Kate's body in the concrete foundation, intending to bury it under cement. As dawn breaks, Chris arrives at the construction site to confront Sebastian, just as Kate's body is slowly being covered in cement. Chris enters Sebastian's office and immediately assaults him. He demands to know where Kate is, but Sebastian remains silent. Chris steps out and tries calling Kate's phone again, only to hear it ringing nearby. He quickly stops the cement truck and begins tearing apart the concrete foundation to save Kate. Sebastian approaches but can only watch as Chris desperately calls for an ambulance. That morning, Kate is in the hospital and regains consciousness, with Chris by her side. Meanwhile, Tariq and Danny wait by the sea, and when the salt dissolves and the counterfeit bills appear, they eagerly collect all of them. Elsewhere, Sebastian is imprisoned and attempts to approach Chris's father, whom he has seen as a father figure, but the man ignores him. Andy goes to an auction, notices the van they used, and purchases it for $800. Chris and his group visit Jim to hand over the counterfeit bills, and in exchange for their efforts, Jim pays them $3 million. As they leave, Jim casually mentions a famous painting stolen from Panama, valued at $140 million or $20 million on the black market. Feigning ignorance, Chris says he hasn't heard about it. Once they leave, they return to the van Andy purchased and find the painting inside. The three rejoice, planning to sell the painting and split the $20 million. In the final scene, Kate walks onto the balcony of their new home, highlighting the fact that their family is now living a life of luxury. Thank you so much for staying till the end. If you enjoy this video, please consider leaving a like and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for future uploads.